All right, so welcome to tonight's Rise and Tide Foundation workshop. It's been quite the ride so far. I'm really happy that we have a really nice turnout. And we just got off of 4 weeks of working through the 1791 report on the subject of manufactures, one of Hamilton's famous reports, which played a major role not just in establishing the foundation of a new system of political economy that had given more substance to the meaning of the American Revolution, since at the time, as we came to discover, the United States was not doing well. Politically, it had declared independence. It had been victorious in a 6-year battle, but economically, it was a basket case. There was no industries to speak of. There was Britain having a complete global maritime control of trade routes, as well as mostly the monopoly on industrial production. And so the US didn't really have the ability to stand on its own 2 feet. It was still heavily reliant upon sharecropping, cash cropping, outsourcing, or basically selling foodstuffs abroad for all of their income. They had no ability to pay off those debts. They had no ability to even work with amongst the early colonies, right? All 13 colonies were in many ways at war with each other. There was no free trade amongst the colonies. There was no ability to have a protective tariff, even basic things that any nation would need to have to be a sovereign nation. The right to have a protective tariff to favor and stimulate the development of local agriculture and industry. That was not even there. So what was running rampant was the ideological spread of British economics, British free trade in the form of Adam Smith's writings that were being promoted. A lot of the early softer-minded founding fathers thought that was a great idea, and didn't think that there should ever be any type of federal government that could do the sorts of things that we see with the Constitution. Now, unfortunately, we see how that could definitely be misused. If your population ever gets so sloppy with their minds and morals that they allow their society to be taken over by a foreign entity, as has been the case far too often and definitely the case today, then certainly powers of centralized government will be used to do bad things. Does that mean that it is the power of the government that is the fault of the bad things that happen? I would say no. I would say ultimately power is power. If you have wisdom using power, you could do good. If you have evil and folly using power, bad will happen. So the question is, what are we allowing? And as John Quincy Adams had said, the republic is built only for a devoutly religious and moral people. If you don't have that cultural standard, you might think you have a republic, but you don't. You're always going to have some form of demagoguery that is going to be able to shape the zeitgeist of the masses into a sort of mob rule, and use people without even their will, even understanding what they're being induced to participate in. They don't even know where their convictions come from if that's the case. So there's a lot of contingencies around which, like, how a republic could work and will work, I believe, in the future. So Hamilton was a good introduction. Before that, we read through Lincoln, a speech by Lincoln on discoveries and inventions. We read through some Henry C. Carey. And today, the long-awaited entry into the mind of the late, great economist Lyndon LaRouche, who died in 2019 at the age of 96. He left very much an intellectual and political legacy that I don't think has properly been felt. And the insights and ideas that he was able to create and apply in the course of his life has created a sphere of, I think, potentials for good, which strategically not a lot of people properly see amongst the West, though, as we saw with the Sergei Glaziev speech of not that long ago, September the 10th, or 9th, which was the birthday anniversary of LaRouche. Sergei Glaziev, a leading figure in Russia, a major grand strategist behind the formation of the Eurasian Economic Union, the integration of that into the Belt and Road Initiative, the establishment of a new alternative financial and security architecture, which he has spoken at great length on, an advisor to Putin. Glaziev recently gave his incredible speech going through his understanding of LaRouche's appreciation for what LaRouche had brought forth, their interactions and friendship together. And so you could sort of see, and he also goes through how his compatriots in India and China have been studying these ideas and are applying them as part of their core strategy. So there's value here. So it was difficult. Pascal, myself, Cynthia were ruminating over what would be the optimal paper by LaRouche that would follow up on the Hamilton report. And so we decided to settle on something that is called Economics at the End of Our Delusion. Or no, at the end of a delusion. It was originally taken from a 2002 special report. Looks like that. I think it can be purchased online. I found a PDF of it. It's long, but it's thorough. And in it, LaRouche is going to not just give an analysis about the absolute unavoidability of a systemic breakdown if certain changes are not met. And keep in mind, this is 20 years ago. And he's describing exactly the process that we're living through right now. And so he didn't have a crystal ball, no magic, no tea leaves. He simply was looking at things that we're told in business management, economics classes that you're not really supposed to really pay much attention to. He was looking at things like, as we're going to discover, the physical parameters of what bounds and limits the human population potential, and how can those boundary conditions either increase or decrease based upon the voluntary decisions to act upon certain categories of ideas. Whether those ideas are right or wrong is whether or not they're in conformity or not with natural law. Natural law being the sort of thing that gave birth to all of human history, or its defiance, at which point you have the thing that gave birth to all great civilizational collapses in dark ages, is to the degree that we tolerated defying natural law. Societies, whether in China, whether in India, whether here, didn't do well. So this is going to be a good little introduction. I'm going to do a screen share, and we'll probably have a couple of speakers like usual. There's a lot of big material, and I don't want people to get intimidated by a lot of the idea content. Might be a little challenging at times. What LaRouche often does is he creates these thumbnail sketches, expecting his readers to take note of the points that they find disagreeable or confusing, and following up largely in their own time. This is like a lot of research, but he's giving sort of a skeletal guideline. And so people could stop if there's something that's really pressing that you want to share, a problem that you have or a question. Feel free. It's an open dialogue process. Otherwise, just take note with a little notebook on the side of like a reference that if he just says like John Locke said something crazy and evil, and you're like, there's no way John Locke said that. Take note of what he's saying, and then see if he's trying to disprove him, and get back to us next week. So let me do a little screen share. Oh, before I do that, last thing, then I'll stop blabbing. This paper, this essay, was preceded by a brief analysis of a device that LaRouche had come up with in the 1990s. I think it was 1995 or 96 at a Vatican conference. There were still some humanists operating within the Vatican at that time. And he was invited to present some of his discoveries of the science of physical economy. And he showcased, to help people understand what the basis of his forecasting was built upon, and how to understand the key structure of the current crisis. Obviously, this is simplified. He demonstrated this, what's called the triple curve collapse function. Something some people here I'm sure have seen, others have not, but basically he updated it in 2001, and this is basically the what you're taught to look at in university and in most modern business management, economics, macro, microeconomics courses, are different theories that apply to the two top curves, the financial aggregates and the monetary aggregates, different theories of pricing, different theories that support the growth of speculative devices, derivatives, other creative financial instruments, inflation theories, how to control inflation using interest, blah, blah, blah. So the monetary and the financial aggregates are what you tend to look at. What you don't tend to look at is what is the most important thing. That's the thing that we're all living in, the physical economic input output. So the actual process that sustains life that we live in, when you turn on your tap water and things come out, when you turn on a light switch and you have light or heating in winter, and the associated qualities of energy that may or may not improve those very needed things that keep people alive. The agriculture that goes into the entire physical economy. And we got a good sense of that by reading Hamilton, the intricacy and the interconnectedness of the physical economic means of production, transportation, transformation of goods from being raw materials into useful things. The last phase should be the considerations of pricing and inflation theories. That's like far down the line. It's important, but not as important as we're led to believe. What's really is the key is this: are you sustaining enough production and quality and infrastructure in science and tech to overcome the limits to growth, to sustain your population at either higher standard of living, or are you doing the opposite while the monetary system is increasing? Unfortunately, since the 1970s, which is where this curve really takes its start, there was more coherence in the early 70s between physical production, industrial production, and your monetary considerations. That has become severed, especially with the dollar being disassociated from the gold reserve and the fixed exchange rate system in 71. Things got ever more into wacky land, with two different universes sort of taking hold for the next 50 years. So that's sort of what preceded LaRouche's current document, is a deeper study on that by a fellow named John Hoeffel. So we're not going to look at that, but I just wanted people to have that in the back of their mind because there will be reference to that. Now back to this.
Matt?
Yes?
Is that possibly around the time that Nixon took us off the gold standard?
That is when Nixon took the...
that happened in 71, so wouldn't that have been around, wouldn't that have been related?
That's what it was.
That was exactly what it was. Yeah, that was Nixon taking the dollar off the gold standard.
In defiance
Exactly.
of Bretton Woods and all that, and without Congress's approval.
Yep.
Probably told by the cabal to do it.
Probably. There was definitely some economic manipulation and warfare behind the scenes to destabilize the US dollar using the differentials in gold prices on the European markets versus the Western markets, or the American markets, where gold had been artificially kept low. That was a stupid Achilles heel in the system at $35 an ounce from the 1930s. And so, gold was selling in Europe for like 4 or 5 times that, and there were certain differentials that created a weakness that could be capitalized upon by speculators in Wall Street and London. Anyway, that's a whole big story. I don't fully have a sense of the 100% grasp of that, but that's essentially it. Yeah, it was set up to fall.
Thank you.
All right, so let's do this. So we'll need a reader, I guess, for the first 45 minutes or so. Then we'll probably have another reader if somebody wants to take the baton. Any volunteers today?
I'd volunteer, Matthew. It's if you can magnify the screen just a wee bit. Otherwise,
my best, good sir, Peter. Okay.
Thank you, sir.
Yes.
Okay. End of a Delusion by Lyndon H. LaRouche, Jr. This report will be issued soon by LaRouche in 2004 Presidential Campaign Committee as the, quote, spear point, unquote, of a special report that will also include a study by Richard Freeman of the American systems methods used by President Franklin D. Roosevelt to get the United States out of the Great Depression, and an analysis by John Heffel and Marcia Baker of how the U.S. economy today is following LaRouche's triple curve collapse function. January 12th, 2002.
Oh, one last quick thing. As a disclaimer, what we're reading, for anybody listening online in the recorded version of this has no affiliation with the LaRouche, either LaRouche PAC organization or the LaRouche organization. It is not either one of those two things. We're just people who, I'm somebody who really is impassioned by LaRouche's ideas, and we're studying his ideas. That is all. We are not taking any ownership of either organization in any official way. Thank you. Sorry, just word of disclaimer.
Thanks, Matt. January 12th, 2002. We could recover successfully from the presently deepening world economic depression, but only if we now choose to do so. It is Hamlet's challenge again, to be or not to be, to accept the deadly heritage of our nation's recently habituated folly, or to free ourselves from the deadly shackles of prevailing opinion, that we might ascend to the sublime and triumph over the fatal error of our recent times. On the time scale of history, the terminal moment of our nation's recent follies has now arrived. Now, if our nation is to survive, We must acknowledge that the leading trends in policy influencing opinion over the recent 30-odd years have been cumulatively disastrous in their net effect. This is especially clear when the U.S. experience of 1966 through 2001 is contrasted with the effect of those different policies which were characteristic of the earlier 1945 through 1964 interval of post-war reconstruction. We must admit, therefore, that in this matter, as Shakespeare wrote in another of his tragedies, the fault lies not in our stars, but in ourselves. The fault lies in the wrong-headed, chiefly post-1964 choice of the policies, which have become, during the recent 3 decades, the prevalent, accepted habits of belief and practice among both policymakers and the population generally. Since the crisis-ridden 1962 through 1965 years, since approximately the time a post-Kennedy USA plunged deeply into its war in Indochina, the world has drifted into a series of radical shifts in prevailing values of the moment. Note the footnote. A set of utopian illusions contrary to any long-term economic reality. However, since these illusions have become the axiomatic, even hysterical standard for setting economic and related policy, this cultural paradigm shift has acquired the character of an unfolding mass delusion.
Okay, just quick. There will be probably a good number of quotes. Some of them will be particularly juicy, I would say. Some of them might just be a reference to something else, so it doesn't really matter. But for those quotes, or those footnotes, I should say, for the footnotes that have a lot of idea content, they should be read, and we should get just a different speaker. Declan, you want to read the footnotes?
Yeah, I'll do that.
All right, sweet. Thanks, man. You don't have to read this one. It's okay.
Carrying on, the economic collapse so induced is not merely an economic collapse. It is not something the quote outside world unquote has thrust upon us. It is a product of the delusion working from inside the minds of most of the population of the United States itself. What we are experiencing is not an intrusion by unwanted events. It is the product of what have become our population's widely accepted beliefs. Therefore, what you are suffering today is, taken all together, the experience of living inside the fag end of a popular delusion. We have, still even at this late date, the opportunity to survive, but if that is to occur, 2 conditions must be met. First, we must make the implied sudden and radical changes in the cultural paradigms governing our policy making. Second, we must do this promptly, without whimpering delays. Merely typical of the more recent trends of wrong-headedness of official and popular opinion are the disastrous effects of the 1995 through 2001 delusion called the quote, the new economy, unquote, or the widespread damage done to the economy and the great and increasing suffering spread among our citizens by such delusions as belief in, quote, free trade, unquote, quote, deregulation, shareholder values, outsourcing, and globalization. Pity the stubborn fellow who says that, quote, we must fix the system, unquote, but like the IMF's Ann Kruger, insists that he will not permit us to act contrary to those infectious delusions which have been, for more than 30 years, the continuing cause of the present crisis. Typical are those who now concede almost anything else, but insist that we must not depart from the bounds of that present IMF floating exchange rate system, which has been, in fact, the chief continuing cause of the world's onrushing monetary, financial, and economic disaster of the past 30 years. If we were to leave such still prevalent pathological assumptions as that untouched, no economic recovery of the constitution of the present society would ever become possible. I do not propose that we should return exactly to the previous 1933 to 1945 or 1945 to 1964 policies. I offer a much more modest and realistic proposal. We must learn the lesson to be educed from comparing an earlier success with a subsequent catastrophe. We must apply that lesson in ways which include discarding the worst of those presently prevailing beliefs, which were widely popularized during the recent 35 years. We must build upon the recognition of those achievements of that 1933 to 1964 recovery and growth, which led us out of an earlier economic depression and the after effects of devastating World War.
Hey, just quick, Peter, do you have like a blinking sound happening anywhere on your side?
Yes, I do, Matt. I do have banners that sound off when I get an email. I'll have to figure out how to silence that.
It's not the worst thing in the world. I wanted some closure to that.
Okay.
That's fine. Okay.
Sure.
Obviously, if you are able to come up with a way to silence that, that's wonderful. If not the end of the world. It's okay.
Okay. Thanks, Matt. But we must also go beyond these precedents to add some improvements which were either lacking in the general policies in the 1945 to 1964 system or are peculiarly appropriate to the changed circumstances confronting us as a result of recent decades' developments.
Cool.
What this report contains. By the nature of the present world crisis, this report must include programmatic and analytic definitions of the problems and the methods of their solution. However, given the nature of competent knowledge of economics among legislators, economists, and citizens generally, the presentation of the essential elements of analytical and programmatic materials must be supplemented by educational materials which are indispensable if the reader is to achieve competent understanding.
Right.
I think we got to scroll up.
Yeah, that was my bad here. Sorry.
No problem. Understanding of both the crucial features of and solutions for this onrushing global economic social catastrophe. If the reader is patient with me, when I am compelled to turn for a moment to relevant educational materials which may, at some points, annoy him, we may hope that history will repay his or her courtesy to me with the kindness of the benefit he or she will therefore receive from times to come. This present report, taken as a whole, includes contributions by EIR economists, specialists, EIR economic specialists, Richard Freeman, John Heffel, and other contributors, particularly their study of some of the presently most relevant features of the successful measures of economic recovery from a general depression, which were taken under the leadership of President Franklin D. Roosevelt. A review of crucial features of the Franklin Roosevelt approach to recovery is being supplied by those specialists. In my part of this report, my assigned focus is limited, as much as is allowable, to those other presently most crucial issues of scientific method which were either not included in that president's approach or are changes which have not been taken into account until now. My part features certain key excerpts from among my original contributions to economics, excerpts which not only make it possible to explain the roots of the Franklin Roosevelt reform's success from a scientific standpoint, but which also identify those features which must be added to our present monetary, financial, social, and economic policies if we are to bring a successful economic recovery into motion under the specific circumstances of the present crisis. Meanwhile, it is most important for the reader that I emphasize that which recent developments have demonstrated, and that in the most dramatic way. My qualifications for speaking with such a tone of authority on these matters are outstanding in the world today. What I have proposed are bold, sudden, but indispensable measures. Therefore, they must tend to meet stiff resistance, unless the depth and extent of my authority in such matters were clearly stated. Therefore, I must emphasize that more than 30 years of my consistently successful long-range forecasting has settled factually the crucial questions of the dispute between me and my opponents. The experiment has been conducted over nearly 2 generations, and the results are conclusive in my favor. For related reasons, my part in this report must include emphasis upon certain notable elements of analytical method, which are uniquely the fruit of original discoveries made by me in the specialized field of the Leibnizian science of physical economy. The combination of the present world crisis, and here was footnote number 2.
I'll read it at the end of this paragraph. I guess
Okay.
that's how we'll do it. We'll wait till the end of the paragraph, and we'll read whatever footnotes are in there.
And the changes in the physical economic condition of the planet during the recent half-century present the world with problems whose significance had been overlooked in earlier times. My own special contributions to the science of physical economy are therefore an integral part of the new subject matters which must be included within our nation's economic policy deliberations.
All right, Declan, you're up.
Yeah, okay. The science of physical economy was originally developed by Gottfried Leibniz through a series of original discoveries of universal physical principle, which he introduced during the interval 1671 to 1716. By intensive adolescent studies in 17th and 18th century philosophy, made me a disciple of that great man's work, which led me, more than 1 decade later, into my own original additional contributions to that field, notably the American system of political economy as associated with the work of Benjamin Franklin. Alexander Hamilton, the Careys, and Friedrich List were partially products of the impact of Leibniz's work on those minds, each in his own time. The American system of political economy has nothing in common with the teachings of John Locke and Adam Smith, but is directly opposed to both on the grounds of fundamental opposition respecting scientific principles.
And I think after this reading is done in a few weeks, it'll be probably 3 weeks, we'll read some Leibniz and get a sense of what was it that Leibniz was doing, this guy who discovered the calculus in terms of applying his insights into universal principles in the world of human economy and human social organization to create something brand new. So that's something that we'll look at very soon.
Worse than 1930s Great Depression. For example, for reasons to be considered in the course of my account, consider the following. At the present time of accelerating world crisis, the reshaping of the interacting but distinct factors in our national monetary, financial, and economic policies must go beyond what was done in organizing earlier recoveries of our national economy. Typical among the causes for the differences between the earlier and present World Depression are the following. As I have emphasized in earlier locations, when the preceding World Depression struck with global force during 1929 to 1933, about a dozen years, less than a generation, had passed since the massive buildup during the 1861 to 1917 interval of European civilization's physical economic growth and productivity, military power, and other technological advances. Today, nearly 35 years have passed, nearly 2 generations, since the willful destruction of the per capita physical productive power of civilization began, a destruction typified at the beginning by the savagery wreaked upon the United Kingdom's economy by the first Harold Wilson government. The challenge today is therefore of qualitatively greater magnitude and complexity than that confronting Franklin Roosevelt during the 1930s. Apart from Harold Wilson's almost Luddite wrecking of the British economy, the principal other initial damage to the 1945-1964 recovery of the US and world economies was introduced by Richard M. Nixon, beginning with the impact on national policy of his 1966 to 1968 campaign for the presidency. Nixon's later decision of August 1971, wrecking the original Bretton Woods system and putting the world under the ruinous lunacy of a floating exchange rate dictatorship, is crucial. His launching of the present floating exchange rate monetary system, then built into the present world monetary financial system, those axiomatic features which foredoomed it to collapse unless those changes had been reversed. The worst damage done to the US economy itself, even worse than by the Henry A. Kissinger-controlled Nixon's follies themselves, was set into accelerating motion under the Zbigniew-Brzezinski-controlled 1977 to 1981 US Carter administration. The latter administration, following the script which Britain's H.G. Wells had presented in his 1928 The Open Conspiracy, willfully wrecked the largest ration of the physical and financial infrastructure upon which both the US economic recovery from the 1930 Depression and the post-war growth had depended. The world monetary financial system is now hopelessly doomed. It cannot be reformed. It can only be replaced by returning to something like the original Bretton Woods system of the 1945 to 1958 interval. During the entire period, especially during the period since Alan Greenspan's predecessor, Paul Volcker, introduced the present policies of controlled disintegration of the economy into the Federal Reserve System. The 1979 to 2002 edition of this set of axioms into the world monetary financial system by Volcker turned monetary and financial policy into an engine for destroying the real economy. This was accelerated under Presidents Nixon, George H.W. Bush, and William Clinton, beginning with two notable pieces of 1982 legislation, Garn-St. Germain and Kemp-Roth. The real economy has been accelerating downhill ever since. See figures 1A and 1B.
All right, there's a lot in there. I guess, Declan, you could read the two footnotes, but you also had something of value in your in the chat box. Why don't you? What is your question exactly?
Well, so we're talking about like Bretton Woods and how that all went up, pegging the U.S. currency to the dollar, and then how Nixon kind of stopped that. But the way I understood it, they replaced it with something else. They had to peg it to something, I guess, and so they pegged it to the price of oil. They said you have to buy oil from Saudi Arabia using dollars, which basically pegged it to the price of oil, and that kind of lent a sort of value to the dollar at the same point. And so how is that different?
That is a great question, Declan. The key there was the what determines the value, the price of the oil on the global markets. Was it tied to the actual physical considerations of the refinement of the oil, the placing of the barrel, the motion of the content from point A to point B to be used? Did it have any like of those physically scientific parameters basing the pricing of the oil, or was it based increasingly on spot markets and futures markets based upon purely the desire to maximize profit by speculators who didn't really care about the oil itself or the production, industrial production that was sustained by that oil. And that's the problem. That's the sleight of hand. Because yeah, sure, if the oil was actually honestly priced according to reality, it wouldn't be necessarily an intrinsically bad thing. You're totally right. But that's where the logic of everything goes myopic, maximize, extract profit in the present with no considerations of physical reality. That type of radical free market logic really became a bit of a demon. And the US dollar became something that was, its fate and value was then tied to the price of irrationalism.
And we had this introduction of an arbitrary fiat military-based force to drive the price of petroleum and insert the dollar as a gatekeeping material on which the administrations peg the price of the dollar, rather than something productive, real, tangible, and a function of physical energy production in the world or a nation. I'm seeing that was just a huge deal that between 71 and 74, there was the American administrations inserted the dollar as the gatekeeper for all sorts of economic activities. But I'm digressing.
Yeah, there's a really good book by Bill Engdahl called The Century of Oil. Fantastic book, so good. People might want to even write that down. A Century of Oil by Engdahl. And it goes through this thoroughly, better than anything I've ever seen. You can get it, I think, for free online as a PDF for maybe $20 on Amazon. It's worth it.
And he writes frequently for Global Research. That's
Yep.
the first place I saw his name.
Yep. All right. So we got a couple of footnotes.
Okay. So the one was talking about number 4. I don't know what that was in reference to, the Federal Reserve System.
That was in reference to, yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Fred Hirsch, former editor of the London Economist, writing in Alternatives to Money Disorder, New York Council for Relations, 1977, affirmed that controlled integration,
Disintegration
in the world economy is a legitimate object for the 1980s. Paul Volcker delivered in the Fred Hirsch Memorial Lecture, Warwick University in Leeds, UK, in November 1978, and began his speech by citing Hirsch's dictum on controlled disintegration. Campaigning as a U.S. Democratic presidential pre-candidate in New Hampshire on October 16, 1979, I denounced Volcker's October 1979 actions, published in EIR, blah, blah, blah. The Carter administration's demolition of the U.S. economy was pre-designed by the New York Council on Foreign Relations. Going on, reference. A project co-supervised by Carter National Security Advisor, Egypt. Oh my God.
Yeah, it's a tough one at first. Zbigniew Brzezinski.
Zbigniew Brzezinski. The Secretary of State and Secretary of State Cyrus Vance. And so the other one was the real economy has been accelerating downhill ever since.
Right.
Yeah. The combination, and footnote number 5, the combined Nixon and Carter administrations set into motion a set of relations among monetary, financial, and economic processes, which I have illustrated by the pedagogical figure A, the triple curve, or typical collapse function. Speculative gains in financial markets are sustained by diverting monetary flows out of the real economy into financial markets. This is sustained increasingly by looting the economic basis through large-scale attrition in basic economic infrastructure, and by driving down the net after inflation prices paid for wages and production of operatives. Thus, we have a hyperbolic curve upward of financial aggregates, a slower but also hyperbolic curve upwards of monetary aggregate and needed to sustain the financial bubble, and an accelerating downward curve in net per capita real output. This reflects the accelerated looting of the base, e.g. Garn, Saint-Germain, and Kemp-Roth, to sustain the financial bubble.
So let's just, with that in mind, let's just quickly spend 2 seconds just reviewing that. And as we saw at the beginning, oh, Peter, yeah, sorry, I can't see everybody's face, just so y'all know. So you might just have to just jump right in with your voice.
Sure, man. Just dropping a footnote to the footnote. Garn Saint-Germain bill of 1982 referred to a deregulation of the savings and loan industry that Congress passed and President Reagan signed in the first 2 years of his first term. And Kemp-Roth referred to the famous tax cut that Congress passed and President Reagan signed in August of 1981. At 5% cut in income taxes in the first year, 10 and 10. And there were numerous effects on deductions and just pervasive policy changes. And these were two major pieces of legislation that President Reagan signed in his first term.
Right. Yeah, he wasn't such a bad guy, but really dumb on economics. True believer in a lot of this Austrian school stuff.
Yeah, by the way, guys, the footnote is not ended.
Oh, it's not ended? It goes on?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Thank you, Pascal. All right. Yeah, look at you. All right.
Oh, wow. During no later than 2000, the amount added monetary aggregate reached the kind of crossover point, figure 1b, which set into motion the Weimar Germany hyperinflationary explosion of June to November 1923. When such a crossover point is reached, the system is doomed to an early end, a threatened breakdown crisis. At that point, the system must be overhauled in bankruptcy, most of the financial aggregate wiped from the accounts, and a new system supplied to give the economy itself a fresh start. I think that's the real end.
Yeah, that's the real end. Yeah. All right. So now it's just with those fresh eyes, just quickly reevaluate the two-phase collapse function. First one, 1996. The second one, updated figure 1b in 2001, as he described, which obviously features these two hyperbolically increasing rates. The monetary system, obviously, with the bailouts since 2008, that didn't help. And since COVID, that really didn't help, where we've just been printing money out of nothing, justified by nothing. And already back in 2001, it was quite bad, as we can see, where the monetary aggregates began outpacing the financial aggregates. I mean, again, this is an overly simplified curve function. It's not, this could be broken down quite a bit, but all that to say, you're in a hyperinflationary. The only time we've seen this before was in the 20s in Germany, where we saw something analogous with the money printing far exceeding the unpayable debts, right? That very quickly caused that money to lose all value when people realized there was more money than atoms in the sun. And that just realization, that perception broke the charm, the spell, and very soon people were burning money to stay warm, somewhat similar to the process that we can all very quickly see now currently embracing the transatlantic 20 years later. Still, remedies are very, very feasible. It's just it requires an appreciation for what a nation state can actually do, as we see with Russia, China, and those other countries that are moving to establish very quickly a new economic system. They're doing things we in the West are being told you're not allowed to do these things or think that way. They don't have those mental problems, and they're just going and doing it. So it's very feasible. The problem is in the mind, as he said. So where did we leave? It was here, right? The impact.
I think that's right, Matt. I'll pick her up. The impact of this long wave of post-1964 destruction of the physical economy of the USA and much of the world besides has not only introduced policy-making problems of great magnitude, Also, I shall indicate the measures which must be taken to ensure a durably successful economic recovery will take the world into new categories of activity, including new approaches to managing the biosphere. These two, respectively quantitative and qualitative considerations, point toward problems of a type which might have been safely overlooked during earlier periods of successful economic growth. It is the urgency of these new policy-making problems which most clearly defines my contributions to the practice of economic policy shaping as indispensable at this time. I recast that just stated crucial point as follows. Some of the new problems to be considered here and now involve recently emerging strategic factors and also strategic opportunities which had not existed, at least not immediately, over the earlier course of the history of the world since 1776 to 1789. These new conditions of combined threats and opportunities have become functionally unignorable or unignorable under present circumstances. That is where my original discoveries in the field perform an essential role.
Okay. So before moving on, just want to give people a chance. Any pressing thoughts or questions, or are we generally keeping that thumbnail sketch pretty clear in mind?
Yeah.
Keep in mind, I can't see anybody. If you're raising your hand, I probably can't see you. All right, I think we're all holding on to the ride. Okay.
Yeah.
All right, so
he's
keep on going.
I think he's telling us that we've got to use some old compasses, but boy, oh boy, the wind and waves are a lot stronger than they used to be.
Yeah. But yeah, those tools are there, as he's clearly getting across the point. It's not like this is unheard of or unprecedented. This has been done several times before. The tools are available in the Constitution. It's available in a variety of ways. And again, every time they have been applied, they work damn well. So we just have to know our history, and that's the biggest block, is the fact that people have been mentally disassociated from the successes and victories that they've had in previous generations doing combat with this oligarchical beast, for obvious reasons. You know, who's controlling our history books doesn't want us to make these basic lessons, right? So, but they're all over the place.
If I can digress just a moment, Matt, I share that one of the historic misconceptions that I see amongst some of the places where I read are people who misapprehend the differences between the First and Second National Bank of the United States and the Federal Reserve. And it's really important to hold that thought.
Yeah, that's a strong point. Yep. Yeah, not the same things at all, different beasts.
Okay. Moving safely to the exits. The current stage of the world depression can be compared to a fire in a crowded theater. The economy in which you are seated is that theater. Do not panic, but rather prepare to move, as I shall direct you, to the exits that, in an orderly fashion, at a steady pace. First, as if to calm the nerves of the panicked fellows standing next to you, I must remind both of you briefly of my authority for dealing with crises of this specific type. The doctor who specializes in such diseases is, so to speak, here. To seek to calm the nerves of excitable fellows, I situate the discussion against the background of certain relevant, crucial patterns in developments over the period since the election crisis of November 7, 2000. During the interval from U.S. Election Day, November 7, 2000, through January 15, 2001, I issued a series of forecasts identifying both the issues of that election crisis and the expected character of certain crucial developments which would unfold during the first 12 months of the next president's term. During that period, reports documenting those economic and political forecasts appeared in such readily available website and other locations as that of the weekly Executive Intelligence Review and publications of my campaign for the year 2000 U.S. presidential nomination. Today, none of those recent forecasts, nor my earlier documented long-range forecasts dating back 35 years have ever been refuted by subsequent events.
All right, we got a couple of footnotes there. I think the first footnote, you don't have to read that one, Declan. It's literally, for those listening, not reading this, about what looks to me 18 different relevant links to other places where he has made these forecasts that people can find online. So just go for number 7 for now.
All right. In my conventions, a short-term cycle is 1 year. Medium term signifies 3 to 7 years. Long term signifies a period of approximately 8 to 25 years or more. All my basic forecasting since 1959 to 1960 has been long term. My occasional forecasts of improbable conditions to be reached within the short to medium term period ahead have always been based upon a forecast for a long-term cycle. The reasons for those kinds of distinctions and forecasting practices will be indicated within the body of this report. Is that all?
Pascal, that's all? Yep, okay. All right, a year later.
A year later, November 2000 through January 2001, through November 2001 through January 2002, the majority of the same set of forecasters opposed to me then are still echoed by most of the establishment mass mediocrity, repeating today the same kind of foolish propaganda they were emitting a year earlier, with but one curious point of emphasis added. Earlier, that crowd had promised an early rebound of a shaky economy's financial and monetary markets. A year later, approximately the same crowd of forecasters is gushing out similarly dubious sophistries. But the wildly hysterical mercenaries of Wall Street have added their non sequitur. They have argued that since the markets have taken a terrible beating over the course of the past year, now the markets have no room to maneuver. They have no way to go but up. These spinners conclude the markets will surely go up more or less spontaneously. With a gloat in their eye, they predict either that the upward bounce must come sometime later this year or perhaps the next. Those who recall the 1930s will be reminded of the 1929 to 1933 World Depression when, during the Hoover re-election campaign of 1932, the Republicans and most Wall Street survivors promised the voters, quote, recovery is just around the corner. Now today, the new economy has collapsed. Enron is a shambles, the role of the US economy as the importer of last resort for most of the world has already collapsed and will collapse much more. Unemployment zooms as the increase in the number of employers going bankrupt or hovering at the edge also zooms. As governments turn to a next round of budget cutting, they are shocked to discover that the loss of tax revenue caused by the cuts necessarily exceeds the amount cut from government expenditures. A sense of desperation spreads throughout the Americas, Western Europe, Japan, Korea, and elsewhere. All in all, this will look to some like a new world economic depression like that of 1929 to 1933. In fact, it is much worse than was experienced in such places as the USA, Canada, or Europe during the 1930s. Presently, if we put the special cases of Russia, China, and India to one side for the moment, most of the world has clearly entered the beginning phase of what some early 20th century economists discussed under the academic heading of an hypothetical general breakdown crisis.
And I like the fact that he's even here very clearly distinguishing the different economic character of the system of Eurasia, of Russia, India, China, which we obviously, it's more visible now. Back then it was less clear to see, but he was still zeroing in on that. But that image here of the Weimar hyperinflation, really good just to take that in, because it really, that speaks so loudly, right? The value of a mark selling for what is it here? A little over 1,000. I don't even know what the actual pricing is, but you could see the hyperbolic devaluation of this stuff where everyone became a billionaire, but bread was selling for the trillions. So you still couldn't really even buy bread. So that's not a mysterious process, or shouldn't be.
Quantitative and qualitative recovery measures. When compared to today's crisis, the depressions of the 1930s seems relatively a problem of more sharply reduced quantity of economic activity. It would appear to those earlier economists that, as in the case of a depression like that of the 1930s, recovery could now be effected by reversing trends in generation and flows of credit into investments in increased quantities of existing categories of physical output. Those opinions are far too optimistic. The present crisis is essentially qualitative. In the case of the present collapse of the world's monetary financial system, the distinction between quantitative and qualitative is crucial. In the first, simpler case, a quantitative solution for an economy may be more or less adequate if putting the combination of bankruptcy reorganization of the monetary financial system combined with addition of protectionist measures could utilize state-created credit to bring the reorganized economy up to a break-even level, merely through reactivating existing productive and related physical economic capacity. In the second case, the combination of monetary financial reorganization and credit expansion does not rise to a sufficient level of combined active and idle physical productive capacity to reach a break-even level of real turnover. No solution is available within the limits of existing categories of such investment without radical structural changes in the composition of categories of investment and production. A glance at the difference between the first pre-war phase of the US recovery measures of the 1930s and the war mobilization phase helps to clarify the meaning of a distinction between a quantitative and qualitative form of economic depression. The examination of those successive intervals affords a first approximation of the distinction between quantitative and qualitative cases. Even into the war mobilization phase, which began in the United States even prior to the Nazi invasion of Poland, the US economy was still using up significant rations of inventories of semi-finished goods dating from prior to October 1929. Even during that period, large-scale public works programs of more or less qualitative significance, such as the TVA program, did build up the base on which the later relatively explosive wartime economic expansion was based. Indeed, the wartime mobilization would not have been possible without such public works and related investment. The explosive growth of the economic recovery program was a characteristic of the shift of US economic policy priorities to a national arsenal of democracy mission orientation. For those of us who were adults during the 1940s and 50s, the most accessible marker of this arsenal of democracy phase was the US government's production and continued ownership of a vast inventory of machine tools, which were, in large part, leased to private contractors as part of the package for military and related production. The earlier superachievement of President Roosevelt's pre-announced targets for levels of production of military aircraft is typical of the phenomena. It was the combination of infrastructure buildup, heavy rations of capital-intensive production investment, and not only a massive decrease in unemployment, but an accelerating.
Sorry.
No problem. Upshift in technological categories of employment, which characterized the qualitative transformation of the US economy upward over the 1939 to 1945 interval, even under the condition that about 16 millions of us were drawn out of the labor force for military service.
Hold on. Let's just quickly review that image. I've not seen that one before.
Okay.
What is this? Figure 3, U.S. Oh, I think he's going to reference this later. U.S. economy's triple curve collapse function, 2000 to 2001. Did he reference that already, or is that going to come? That'll possibly come later, I think.
I think it's later, Matt, because this is a figure number 3, and I think
Yeah,
we've got
he
up
didn't
to
say that.
1A, B, and 2.
Got you. Okay.
Okay. I shall return to examine this matter of qualitative recovery measures in more precise terms at an appropriate later point in this report. At the present moment, my point is to illustrate the distinction between merely quantitative and qualitative recovery measures, and that with the relatively most accessible choice of real-life clinical case.
Just quick, do people have a general sense of why he selected the pre-war and war phase as to illustrate the quantitative and qualitative differences, generally speaking?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, and the key thing too is, like, a lot of people say, "Oh, yeah, it was the war that caused the recovery. It wasn't the New Deal or the big projects." That's a common thing that's repeated and repeated today. I've heard that so many times. And as he makes the point, I think it's quite good that it's true that the war shifted gears and put the recovery into high gear, but it wasn't really the war that made the wealth, because it was the mission orientation, the idea that you had a goal, that everything became organized around having a goal that had not been accomplished yet. And so your whole society was, all of your priorities were reset, right, to make it happen in the best or most effective possible way, despite what we now know of being the fascist operations to keep the war going, to sustain the war artificially, right, that were going on behind the scenes. We know about a lot of this stuff now. But despite that, the idea of actually having a goal to honestly try to do something, in that case, it was stop the rise of a global fascist New World Order. There's no reason why that can't also be done for peacetime purposes too, right? Just simply have goals that organize all of your priorities, and it could be something very constructive. There's so many constructive things that we could do together as well. It doesn't have to be go to war. So, and the idea of the economic recovery process before that mission orientation happened in the 30s, it was slower going. It was indeed slower, but it wouldn't, had it not been for those large scale investments in the 30s, there would have been no platform upon which the machine tool capacity and industrial capacity could have been built that was needed to then help Russia, help China, with the arsenal of democracy and everything else to win the war. So it was connected, but it was two very different processes at the same time.
Today, a general qualitative breakdown crisis is already darkening the horizon. To illustrate the nature of that challenge, I list a number of typical actions to be taken to halt the depression and launch a self-sustaining recovery. 1, we must A, put the international monetary financial system into immediate government-dictated reorganization. B, restore a fixed exchange rate system. C, establish exchange, capital, financial controls, trade controls, and fair trade forms of protectionist measures internally and externally. D, increase drastically rates of taxation of financial capital gains and substitute production and technology-oriented medium to long-term investment tax credits to entrepreneurs. E, generate large masses of government-created credit at rates between 1 to 2% for chiefly a combination of entrepreneurial investment production and infrastructure investment. And F, implement a general bank reorganization program which keeps needed banks performing essential functions for the community while under even drastic financial reorganization. 2, we replace free trade with the promotion of protected hard commodity international trade as part of the promotion of a global long-term economic recovery effort. 3, we introduce the economic equivalent of a high technology oriented arsenal of democracy recovery program, both in the domestic economy and in world trade, to provide the qualitative dimension needed to reverse the monstrous loss of technologically progressive physical productive capacity and potential, a loss which has accumulated in the world as a whole during the recent 30 years, especially the recent quarter century. We had better take such measures to stop the process of collapse before it hits with irresistible, crushing force. With the guidance and backing of the world's leading economist at that time, Henry C. Carey, President Abraham Lincoln made possible the U.S. economic miracle of 1861 through 1876, as Franklin Roosevelt, at a later point, saved the USA. Under the impact of Roosevelt's intervention, the USA and the world avoided the risk of a slide into an actual breakdown crisis. Nonetheless, as I have already indicated above, I say again that there are certain crucial points of difference between the challenge of organizing an economic recovery under conditions of today's threatened breakdown crisis and the challenge of the world depression successfully met by incoming President Franklin Roosevelt. I shall deal with the most typical such new challenges in my section of this report. By its means, by introducing science to replace the forms of mysticism which have become popular amongst most US academic economists and their dupes, we aim to free the people of the USA and other nations from the deadly grip of that delusion which has brought those dupes, like fabled lemmings, to the brink of catastrophe. Whether we purge our nation's policy shaping of those popularized follies, or the nation destroys itself by clinging to these follies, we may safely forecast the end of a delusion. Either way, by ridding the victims of their fatal follies of belief, or by witnessing the institutions eliminating the carriers of those delusions themselves. The ball is in your corner.
Okay. All right. So that was the sort of preamble, the subjective preamble. We could still get through quite a few pages. Any thoughts or questions before we push onward?
Matt, does it make sense to hew to or to select various metrics for measuring things like inflation or unemployment? And for example, I'm familiar with a fellow named John Williams who publishes something called Shadow Stats, to publish rates of inflation and unemployment as the U.S. government calculated decades past, and compare them to the numbers spewed forth on nightly news today.
And your question is what exactly?
Are there any metrics that we could use to say, hey, this is really what the inflation rate is, this is really what unemployment is, this is really what per capita energy consumption is? Because I did read once that peak per capita energy peaked in 1979. If you just divided calorie output in the entire world divided by the number of people in the world, the peak hit in 79. And does that mean that energy density has declined so drastically since 79? What does that mean?
Yeah. Well, I guess the two things that pop into my mind as you're speaking is number one, LaRouche and his organization used to publish in the 70s and into the early 80s I think it was biannual thick forecasting book, sort of the bi-quarterly forecasts of that year, using a lot of econometric data. they stopped publishing it. They're really tight. I got a couple of copies of these things. They're behemoths, and it had a very specialized audience. But they stopped publishing them in the early, I think 84 or so, because, and LaRouche explained why when he was asked, like, why did you stop these things? And he's like, the problem is the lying, the lying became too rampant. So you couldn't even trust the basic GDP numbers that you were being given by the official Federal Reserve and other layers of the official economists. They were like fudging data so much already, or like mischaracterizing what is production and trying to make production seem as though it was, it expanded to like revenue gained by drug deals or prostitution, and it became very loosely defined, right? And even services and things that were not overtly productive became increasingly defined as productive. Now, the more that happened, and this is already like 40 plus years ago, it became very difficult to use the official numbers for any type of realistic forecasting. It became really tough. So as far as I think the first thing would be that economists return back to looking at actual metrics that matter. When they're using words, we've become very lazy with our words. And number two would be, I think, to have an appreciation for powers, like the actual power of production that people like Henry C. Carey or Hamilton or Henry Wallace talk about. They had a very strong sense that there's industrial power of production, which can increase or decrease based upon whether or not you have a machine tool capacity that is being powered by essential forms of energy that are increasing in quality. So you could produce more with less effort over time if you're making these types of decisions in a proper way. And we're not doing that anymore. We lost that sense completely because we don't value that, and it's the degrowthers, it's the Malthusians who increasingly took over and got rid of, they worked very hard to crush our appreciation for what real production actually means, to the point that today, a lot of people think that Roosevelt was a Keynesian. Keynes being like one of the most rampant eugenics-loving, world government-loving, racist imperialist freaks who hated FDR, and FDR openly hated him, or at least didn't respect him at all. People have actually been led to believe that that's the case. And all Keynes is saying is that if you have an economic crisis, just pump money into making work. And it doesn't matter. There's no ability to qualitatively differentiate from a Keynesian perspective, whether you're, making work, having people build windmills or hydroelectric dams or nuclear power plants. For a Keynesian, each one employs maybe, 10,000 people in a project to do something, and they're all going to get checks that'll be relatively equivalent, and they'll use those checks to buy things. And the act of buying things is going to stimulate, it'll create a demand to stimulate production. The production will create a demand on the state to build infrastructure. And you got this bottom-up weird inversion of reality that has no bearing in reality, because a windmill will destroy your power of production. Your powers to sustain life will be crippled as long as you go down that path, versus the same 10,000 people building and being employed in a nuclear power reactor or investing in next generation fusion. That'll have a very positive, very different effect. And the buying power of the dollar will be very different. So $1, each world quantitatively still uses dollars, but in the one world where we made better decisions, what happens to your each dollar in circulation has more buying power, right? The actual power because your whole society that you're living in is so much more qualitatively superior. So that's why people in the 60s were able to famously, we have these stories where one worker, working in a typical job using one paycheck could sustain a big family, have money put aside for vacation, have a car, have a house. That's all that, forget about that today, because the buying power of the dollar was different than it is in our post-industrial world that we're living in now. My roundabout way of getting it, that's sort of an answer, I guess, best I can.
What is economics? No rational discussion of economics is possible unless we define what that term should signify. Unfortunately, especially today, after the so-called cultural paradigm shift, which erupted during the late 1960s, Most of today's generally circulating definitions of the term are proffers of allegedly self-evident gobbledygook, which are not designed in a way which might provide the hearer with a sense of functional correspondence to reality. The first thing to know is that, contrary to some ivory tower true believers, the subject of economists did not exist in any rational form prior to what is known alternatively as the 15th century or Golden Renaissance. It was that Renaissance which defines the difference between the essentially medieval AD 300 to 1400 history of European civilization and its post-1400 phase as modern civilization. Economy began with the birth of the modern nation state. Over the course of the 15th century, Italy pivoted Renaissance. By national economy, I mean...
I think we had a footnote number 8 in that breath.
Okay. Although, as Professor von der Heydt stressed in 1952, the emergence of the struggle to establish modern society dates from such points as the work of Abelard of Paris, the ideas associated with the work of Frederick II and Dante Alighieri were not brought into their political realization until about the time of the emergence of the great Platonic school at Padua at the turn of the 15th century.
Okay. By national economy, I mean a continuing process of durable improvements in the potential relative population density of the whole population and its posterity. By economics, we should signify the existence and use of some scientifically demonstrable principle which permits us to forecast efficiently the connection between today's practices and the worsening or improvement of the relative well-being of the present population and its posterity as a whole, a generation or two ahead. Footnote 9.
Okay. Well, the reader should be forewarned that I do not accept the definition of the US economy as a capitalist economy. Since the close of the 18th century, especially since the collapse of the Soviet economy, the planet has been dominated by a conflict between two persisting leading forms of national economy. On one side, there has been what Alexander Hamilton and others defined as the American system of political economy. On the opposing side, the principal prospective adversary of that American system has been the dogma and practice of Lord Shelburne's British East India Company's Haileybury School. Today, when the term capitalist system is used, it usually signifies the British system, as it did for Karl Marx in his Capital. I recognize the contrary, the American system, as the natural expression of the healthy form of the economy of a sovereign nation-state republic, and as I qualify the functional significance of that definition as appropriate at appropriate places below.
Thank you.
Economic forecasting, properly understood, signifies assuming accountability in the present for the future consequences of the choices made today. Without such accountability, there is no morality worthy of that name. That requires the existence of a form of government which holds itself efficiently accountable for ensuring such improvements as are measurable in terms of their per capita and per square kilometer physical effects. That is there are a couple footnotes coming up. In applying that definition of economics, it is not sufficient that the government should intend to bring about such beneficial results. The intention must be an efficient one. A couple of footnotes there.
Okay. As qualified later in this report, I define physical effects from the standpoint of what Vladimir Vernadsky identified as the news sphere. I mean the measurable effects on the physical domain which are categorically attributable to either a abiotic, living, or cognitive phase space. The standard of proof for each case is that which has been defined at length by Vernadsky. And number 11, the applicable definition of physical for this purpose is broadly the same which Vladimir Vernadsky employed in defining the noosphere. See Lyndon LaRouche, The Economics of the Noosphere.
If anybody listening on YouTube is confused by the name Vernadsky or noosphere, I will refer you to our series on Vernadsky, which I'll put in the description box of this video, where people can actually listen in and read Vernadsky's writings as far as they pertain to physical economy and the world of Russia and the world as a world back in the 30s and 40s, when Vernadsky was really fighting. There we go.
And there we go. Societies qualifying as such economies did not exist in ancient or medieval history. Those who ruled then used the subject populations as virtual human cattle for the advantage of the ruling oligarchy and its lackeys. For them, as for the notorious feudalist Dr. Francois Quesnay, the fruit of society belonged by divine right to the overlord. The rights of the toilers were limited to the same kind of rights a farmer accords to the lower forms of life he hunts down, or maintains, or culls his cattle. That oligarchical system is also typical of the philosophy of John Locke and the radical positivist definition of shareholder value recently upheld by the majority of the US Supreme Court. The notion of accountability for the general welfare of a human population, as specifically human as a whole, did not exist. I think there was just a tiny footnote 12 that talked about it. Yeah. For example, neo-Akamite.
Hey, that was Declan's job.
Ah, sorry.
I'm joking.
Flag on the play.
Any, again, like I said, it's always good to have, when reading a LaRouche paper of this sort, to have a little notebook and just take notes of names, thoughts, questions that you might want to follow up on later and review in future studies. Since obviously he doesn't expect the reader to know every reference that he's saying, but I could say for anybody who's read the Hamilton reports that we read the other weeks, Francois Quesnay and the physiocratic school is a key point of that battle in 1791 in the United States, where that was becoming really propagandized and believed by a lot of Americans as the way to go, is just having, you know, be one with the land, don't pollute your morals with industry, or, you know, just stay pure, like this noble savage idea, right? That industry and technological progress disassociates you from your heart and soul and goodness. And that whole thing, that's actually, you could see how this has also been revived, right? Amongst the Davos crowd, which thinks that's a great thing. Yeah, that's true. And that's why that's awesome. Versus those who don't like the Davos crowd, who tend to think, oh yeah, anytime you allow technological progress to happen, the empire will get more, you'll have a reduction in freedom, as empires will use progress and technology to enslave you. So you always get this false theory of technology, industry growth, and the loss of human freedom in a lot of these ideologies that are promoted by the empire. And that was the same thing with Quesnay and Smith and Locke back in the day too, and Rousseau has it in his own way.
But that paragraph just got me to thinking in a wholly different way about the Jubilee cycles that existed in Near Eastern societies, you know, up to, you know, the beginning of the first millennium BCE. I've got to think about that some more. So here comes the next paragraph. Although the first reasonable approximation of true nation-state economies were those of France's Louis XI and England's Henry VII, the adoption of the set of universal principles on which the modern sovereign form of nation-state and its economy have been based, the notion of the general welfare, had already been brought into being earlier in the same century largely through the leading role of Cardinal Nicholas of Cusa, as typified by one, his Concordantia Catholica, which set forth the principled argument for replacement of the imperial system as it existed under feudalism with a community of principle among individually sovereign nation states. Two, his founding of modern experimental physical science is merely typified by his De Docta Ignorantia. His role in pulling together the circle of scientists and other influentials on whose work Columbus, amongst others, depended for the wave of great transoceanic explorations launched during the latter decades of that century. The pivotal principle of law upon which that coming into being of the sovereign nation state republic was premised was the adoption of the doctrine of natural law, known variously as the general welfare or common good, as typified by the central argument of law, later expressed by the 1776 U.S. Declaration of Independence, and as stated explicitly as the fundamental law of the USA in the preamble of the Constitution, U.S. Federal Constitution. Although this involves subject matters which are, in part, lodged in the history of pre-modern centuries, even the mere right to existence of the institution of the modern nation state has never been uncontested, even within globally extended European system up to the present day. British colonial relics of the cultural heritage of the ancient Rome and medieval feudalism have more than merely persisted into the 20th century. The effort to reverse the clock of modern history back to brutishness has been the dominant post-World War II trend in Anglo-American policy shaping for about half a century. The US wars against its historic adversary, the British monarchy, are an example of the conflict between the US defense of the principle of the general welfare against that modern relic of the Norman allied imperial maritime power of Venice's pro-feudalist rentier financier policies, the policies of the British monarchy since 1714. The preamble of the Constitution of that British puppet, the Confederate States of America, for instance, stressed the suppression of the principle of the general welfare in favor of the immoral John Locke's defense of slavery.
I just got to say one thing really quickly here. I had a debate 2 days ago on TNT radio with a friendly opponent on the issue of Lincoln and FDR, mostly FDR, but also Lincoln. And he has the view that Lincoln was just the worst guy in the world, a destroyer of freedom, just like Hamilton and FDR. But I read through, and I didn't get to bring this up because the debate didn't go that way, unfortunately. But I got to review the Confederate Constitution because he's told me that he believes that if Lincoln hadn't put in any effort to actually pass laws to legalize slavery, that it would have just dissipated on its own if the South was left to itself. I'm like, okay, sure. You think that? I read the Constitution of the Confederate States, which anybody can do. It literally enshrines in the Constitution that no law shall ever be passed by the Constitution that will ever allow a slave to go free. It's like, it's right there. It also enshrines that free trade will be the sole operating ideology of the Confederate States, and that no government role shall ever be played in economic policy. So those things, but it actually says we'll never let a slave go free or pass any law that does so ever. So I just thought that was interesting.
Yeah.
It's funny they let go of the free market when it comes to their slaves, right? It's like they're all free market, but then the slaves, well, you can't do anything about that.
They're just property, man. Didn't you read John Locke?
Oh yeah.
And John Locke also, just for those who might be confused, that there's a fellow named Phil Valenti who did a really great long study on John Locke as a shithead. And that's not his words; those are my words. But Locke himself was in practice a key shareholder of the British Royal Africa Company, and he was the inspiration of the Southern or South Carolina Constitution, which does make it very explicit that black people are a form of property. But he, in his life as a human being in the world, his fortune was gleaned off of the black slave trade in the 18th century. And so the fact that we're told, even Americans are told, that John Locke was the inspiration for the American Republic, I mean, no. It's a lie.
Yeah, makes you wonder how they managed to depart from the phrase life, liberty, and property, which many people ascribe to John Locke, to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness in the second sentence of the Declaration of Independence.
Exactly, Peter. Good point.
Thanks. Today, the depraved relics of Europe's ancient and medieval past are resurgent in such forms as so-called globalization, shareholder value, the rule of world law, and the effort to establish a military dictatorship in the form of universal fascism. Fascism is typified today by such lackeys and cronies of the late Professor William Yandell Elliott as Henry Kissinger, Zbigniew Brzezinski, and Samuel P. Huntington. These are typified today by family interests and associated major law firms gathered around such influential institutions as the H. Smith, Richardson, Olin, and Mellon Scaife foundations, and associated circles such as the Foreign Policy Research Institute, the American Enterprise Institute, the Cato Institute, and the Rand Corporation. That fascist ideology is also rooted axiomatically in the doctrines of the Mont Pelerin Society, the Heritage Foundation, et al. Typical.
Hold on.
Okay.
Quick note, just to appreciate the pictures here, with Zbigniew, Samuel P. Huntington, and Kissinger, with the caption, fascism is typical. Oh yeah, that's basically three modern fascists.
Yeah.
And there was I think a reference to Michael Ledine's universal sorry, Declan? No, it's basically Michael Ledine's Universal Fascism, the Theory and Practice of Fascist International. Is that actually a book that Michael Ledine wrote? Whoa. Pascal says yes. Okay. My God, I gotta buy that. Huh. He just came right out and said it. Okay.
Matt, I would like to make a comment about fascism, if possible.
Yeah, do it.
Okay, because at fundamental definition, fascism is the close association of the state and corporations, okay? So if you take that mere definition, states that are rather centered on the welfare of the people like China or Russia can be considered as fascist, okay? Because they are a close association between state-owned enterprises and the state, okay? But I think here again, why I want to interrupt you guys because of that, because I often hear that kind of argumentation coming from that basic definition. But you always have to take into account the epistemological dimension. In the case of states, within which you have a close association between state power and corporations, what is true in the case of China and Russia, you have to take into account too the fact that the government takes care of the epistemological development of the people and is an open oligarchy, if you want, okay? Versus the closed oligarchy of the British Empire, where you have to be born in certain families. And contrary in the case of Russia and China, the oligarchy, once again, by strict etymology, the power of the few. And if we take the case of China, for example, you have 95 million Communist Party of China members. If you take 95 million and you put it on 1,400 million, you get about 7% of the population. Okay, so it's an oligarchy by strict etymology, the power of the few. However, the big difference is that's an open oligarchy. You can enter into that oligarchy by your own effort. Okay, so I just wanted to make that difference because I often hear that people would take advantage of the basic definition of fascism, meaning the close association of state power and corporations, to say that after all, the 5 permanent members of the United Nations Security Council are all fascist states. If you take it in a naive manner, it's not false, but you have to go deeper.
I appreciate what you're saying, Quan. I mean, I get the sense that people tend to be very nominalist in our current society, and they tend to have their own preconceived idea of definitions of words, which are either oversimplified or charged with fallacy. And so they end up having these debates using words that they either don't understand, or they're using, you know, 2 people or more people are talking using similar words, and they don't realize that they actually have very different thoughts associated with, or different assumptions and definitions with each word that they're using. So they're in different universes. That being said, I think that that's why LaRouche also put a lot of emphasis on this question of the general welfare as like the purpose or mandate of a society that gives vitality or meaning to the laws and legitimacy to those laws, is whether it is obedient to the well-being of the whole or not, if it's in defiance, at which point you could have various different structures or types of governments, but if they're obedient to that idea and treat the individual as if they actually have a soul and a mind, instead of just treating them like utilitarian robots to be like programmed by a master class, as you said, of a closed oligarchy or something.
Absolutely.
Very different outcomes.
Yes, absolutely. Because let's say that there is a big debate, okay, if a truly open government should be an oligarchy or not. I would say that's debatable. And what is not debatable, however, is that if it's a closed oligarchy, it's bad. If an open oligarchy, it might be good. It depends on the intentions.
Yeah, I mean, we don't have to go on to that, but the word oligarchy, I guess for me, if you mean it literally through pure etymology, ruled by the few.
The rule by the few.
I got you. You can't have everybody equally ruling at no matter how utopian you are, it would break down. You obviously have to delegate authority to those who have the ideally qualifications and wisdom, and not simply are pretty speakers who can use flowery language to win a mob.
Yeah. Yes, and just a short comment, okay, about the BNPM, the big light propaganda machines that would brainwash the people into a very close understanding of certain word without the etymological understanding, okay? Because most of the time, the propaganda against the Russian oligarchs, for example, okay, oligarchs is equal to bad necessarily. And after all, and I think that we should use the word plutocrats, okay? Because when we say oligarchs, we mean people having power because they are immensely rich. That's what we mean. And it's better to say plutocrats.
I guess so. Yeah, it's true.
So what's plutocrat then?
Plutocrat does come from the Greek words, which means power of the rich. Well.
Yeah, the power of the rich, Pluto's rich.
An oligarch isn't that?
Now, oligarch from oligos, meaning the few, and arche, the power, the command of. Okay, so oligarchy is a form of governance where you have the few governing the majority. Okay.
So you're saying those few don't really have to be rich?
No, not necessarily, because if I'm sorry, Matt, I will take 2 minutes.
No, it's fine. I'm thinking actually this might be a good spot to just go into. You know what? Actually, here, let's take pause here. This section goes on for a while, so what I'd suggest is that we now just have open conversation. That's fine, and then we'll just pick up next week. So let me do a stop share.
So if I answer to, I think it's Kelly, if I recognize your voice. Okay. Yeah. Okay, so because oligarchy simply means the rules of the few. Okay, so that kind of few people can be aristocrats, okay, not in the sense of hereditary nobility, but in the Platonic sense of aristocracy, the power of the best. And those best, most of the time, are few. Okay, suppose I'm a propagandist for the Chinese Communist Party, okay? The Chinese Communist Party is about 7% of the Chinese population. Okay, so by definition, they are a minority. They are a few. Okay, 7% compared to 93% is a few. So if you accept that those people have been selected by a very strict system of selection, they are kind of the best of the Chinese society. They are oligarchs by etymological definition. It's the power of the few. Okay, but the nature of the oligarchy is not necessarily plutocratic, meaning that the fact that they are ruling China, it's not because they are wealthy. Some of them are wealthy, but they are not necessarily wealthy. In the West, the criterion to be accepted in the highest position of power is to be enormously wealthy. So the Western oligarchy is plutocratic by nature.
Where China is more like an oligarchy?
China is an oligarchy because you have 7% of the population ruling 93% of the population.
Where we call it communist.
Oh, communist is a historical legacy because they went in the 30s and in the 40s, they needed help to construct China. So they asked help to the US and the UK, but since they refused, the only reasonable alternative at the time was Red Russia. And Red Russia gave help to China. That's why the Communist Party of China is still ruling nowadays. But any nationalistic party in China at the time would have been an appropriate political organization to restore China. It happens that it was the CPC because Red Russia was willing to have Red China at the time.
Like I talk to the average person, you know, in my life, and I try to talk about China, and right away it's like they're communist. Communist is bad, and it's like it's so hard to get around that when you're talking with the average person.
Yes, but here again we have to talk about the power of words, okay? Because in North America, in the West in general, communist is equal to people having no moral principles, wanting to destroy the society, and etc. Okay. Once again, that's what we call in linguistic the semantic field. Okay, the semantic field is all the concepts and images and things that are associated with a word because of what I call the dominant culture, and that is absolutely okay. I mean, all society has a dominant culture, and certain words are loaded with meanings that are not what it means if you know the etymology and if you know the historical context.
I'll say one thing here. Declan has a very interesting question. It's an important question and thought. And Pascal actually picked up on it, and he has a response that he'd like to share with that. But Declan, why don't you put it into your own words so I don't have to read it out loud.
Okay, yeah, I was wondering, Quan, you were talking about fascism, and you defined it as the government and corporations being together. I was always taught that that was socialism. The government controls the means of production, and that fascism was an idea like a race saying we're the best, and we're going to impose by law on everybody that we're the best, and everybody else is less than us. They're subhuman, and so they're like Hitler. And so, what is that the correct definition?
Well, that's interesting. The way I wanted to answer it.
Yes.
I thought about it a bit when
Pascal,
Quan
go
was
ahead.
mentioning the fascism as being, you know, the connection between all elements of society, which is true when you look at actually the symbols that were used with the axe at the middle, with the reefs being tied together with a string. That was one of the symbol that were used at the time when Mussolini took over in Italy, that came from the Roman Empire. So when you think about it, there's really, and other people have written about it, but the Roman roots of fascism going through, if you want to go, also you can take a look at Napoleon Bonaparte in France at the beginning of the 19th century. So it's not, fascism is not only something that is, kept in at one point, one time in history, but it's really an idea of how society is organized. And before fascism was used as a word in the 1930s, when it became very popular, the word that was used in Italy and elsewhere was corporativism.
Yeah.
So the idea was that basically,
exactly.
there's this concept of republic, and when you go back at the root, res publica is the public thing. So the common, you could say it's linked to that, to the idea of the common good, right? So
Exactly.
that was the idea. These are two very different ideas, and so fascism is really, in a sense, an outgrowth, a spin on the imperial idea, the imperial way of ruling. And so you're right. Basically, fascism or other totalitarian ideologies basically use the power of the state, and obviously they say it's for your own good.
Yeah.
It's for your own good that I'm going to take all freedoms away, and I'm going to tell you how things are going to work, and all of society is going to work around this idea. So religion, philosophy, everything, finance, economics, it's all going to be revolving around that. But it's not really the government that's running this. It's corporativism. So it's not for the interest of the common good. It's for the interest of a few. And I would reference people. And there's an interesting videos that the Rising Tide has published on the attempted coup on FDR and the rise of fascism in the 1920s, 30s, with General Smedley Butler, who actually blew the whistle on that. People should look at this to see another example of how things were going that way actually in the United States. So it's always a question of, what kind of principle are holding your society, and is it really for the common good, or is it for a financial oligarchy that is running the show from behind? They don't necessarily put themselves in front. They will have their puppets like Mussolini, like Hitler, and sometimes the puppets decide that they want to become the puppet master. That's part of the danger of the whole thing of producing these monsters.
Yeah. I would like to say that everything Pascal said is very right, okay? But we have to distinguish at the core, fascism is truly the corporation which is at the center of the state. Yeah. And everything like in the Roman Empire, well, as Pascal said very rightly, fascism is from Latin fasces, okay? F-A-S-C-E-S. And the fasces are the states that are bound together, that a lictor, which is a soldier, going with a Roman senator, that would protect him with those sticks, okay? That he would use those sticks to hit people that would attack the Roman senator. So it's a symbol of majesty and of power for the Romans, okay? And it has been inherited by Western civilization, okay? So it's a symbol of majesty of the state. But at the core, as Pascal said very rightly, is the corporation using the states for their own advantages. That's the core Okay, that's why I said that the true basic definition of fascism is from the economic standpoint. Okay, it's the corporation taking control of the state, or the close association of state powers with the corporations. That's the core. Around the core, you have what I would call the circus. Okay, the circus, the symbols. For example, some racist theories, for example, that we are better than certain races and so on. But those are, I would not say superficial, but secondary elements used to manipulate psychologically certain populations. Okay, so let's not confuse the core definition with the circus around it to make it pass within certain populations.
And
Okay.
Matt, I'd add an historic point. Let's remember, there was the Dutch East India Company, which was a corporation to advance the Dutch crown. We had the British East India Company and the British West India Company, which advanced the interests of the crown. They were critical agents and remain critical agents of the crown. And the corporate form did come into existence under Rome, and they had limited purposes. And often senators controlled these corporations, whether they owned a lot of land for growing crops, or whether they owned a mine, for ferrous or precious metals. And that corporate form advanced the crown's interests, or the empire's interests. And that's just an historic support to what Quan is pointing out. And I would submit that by design and purpose, the first and second national banks of the United States were absolutely different and antithetical to those purposes, whereas the Federal Reserve manifests a purpose not unlike the Bank of England or these corporations that have advanced, the crown, be it a financial crown. An imperfect thought, but I just had to share that.
Absolutely.
I want to point out one critical difference between classical fascism and what we have today. In classical fascism, we have a predominance of political sphere, and there is a leader. There is a Duce, the Führer. There's always and that political party rules over the economy. You don't have that anymore. You have an inverted totalitarianism where we have a puppet president. We have a puppet facade of republican institutions. They are completely subverted to the economic sphere, which is owned by very, very few people. We'll call them plutocrats, whatever. But this is an important distinction, because when we use fascism, we are always evoking this idea of a single guy, a leader and all that. There is no leader in the US, in the empire. There's no leader, okay? The force is beyond the visible facade of governance, okay?
Well, I'd say I have a quick thought to share in regards to that idea, and I'll use that as a quick promo. Cynthia's working on a two book series. The first volume should be out in the next 2 weeks or so on the origins of fascism in a new way that brings it directly into the question of what is the system of oligarchism as a continuous function from the days of Rome and Babylon to the present. Bringing that consideration into the mix, she spends a lot of time looking at the role of the Fabian Society, which nominally were socialists, but you'll find that people like Mussolini was originally a socialist. He was also a big supporter of what was called or not him himself, but a lot of the people in his entourage were enmeshed with an organization known as the Pan-European movement of Count Coudenhove Kalergi. Coudenhove, Richard Coudenhove-Kalergi. That's him. I got him. And it wasn't just him, like over the years, you had people like Hjalmar Schacht as well, who was a devout adherent to Pan-Europa of Kalergi, and many of the American fascists who were promoting the solution of fascism as a response to the economic crisis of the 1920s and 30s against Roosevelt, and who tried to oust Roosevelt in that fascist coup with Smedley Butler. These were all the same organizers that were tied to the Council on Foreign Relations, set up by the Milner Group, right, that had taken control of Britain in 1916 even, and had set up the Royal Institute for International Affairs, that had created the Rhodes Scholarship movement. And so Cynthia, in her first book, is going to go through the intersection of the Fabians, leading Fabian socialists, who really only saw socialism as a nice little honey trap to get people who were abused by the abuses of capitalism to, basically rally with unions and other things to a new organizational structure that would be controlled by a master class of eugenicists who didn't really care about the people that were supporting them. And people like Oswald Mosley was very close in bed with some of these Fabians as well. The leader of the guy who aspired to be the fascist head of Britain, right? So all that to say, and then her second book is going to go through more the Theosophists.
Yeah.
The Theosophists were doing to promote a new form of Luciferianism, but with a Neoplatonic twist, a literalist reading of the Plato Republic ideology or idea, around the same idea of giving rise to a new global Roman Empire that would create a global stasis under a priesthood at the top. So that's going to be the second book, much more into the weeds,
Yeah.
But yeah, this whole thing, it's all about the rectification of terms. I think we're just all used to using terms that are just underdefined or misdefined. And then we get into these infinite discussions without really getting at the essence of the thing itself, which is.
Yeah. And I'm quite a maniac for that, because and now in the West, you just need to use some words, and people just stop to think with the use of some words.
Yeah, like the word socialism will shut down a lot of people, just the word itself. Yeah.
Yes.
And it's like, it means so many different things to so many different people. And there's like the Fabians who will use socialism in one way, and Mussolini will have used it in another way. And then you'll have like Paul Robeson or Kwame Nkrumah, who will have used it in a totally different way, right? Because they actually care about social values and their ideas. Well, we need to actually care about societal values on economic considerations, and they'll have a very different set of outcomes. So it's not like they're not all created equal,
No.
Regardless of which form of government we're talking about, isn't it also part of the problem that power really only means power over other people? I mean, what else are you going to have power over? And so any kind of oligarchy is going to attract certain types of people that are just prone to abusing power because of their desire to have power in the first place. Isn't that partly how the cabal got so many minions? A lot of whom were not wealthy either initially. But I mean, it's a lot of it is just ego trips, power trips.
Okay.
I mean, power just attracts sociopaths, kind of the same way working with children so often attracts pedophiles. It's kind of the nature of who you attract. Isn't that part of the problem with an oligarchy of any sort?
That's a very deep question, because I would ask you the following question. Is it possible to imagine a society in which the education is such that it would be seen as a kind of honor to be granted power and not the occasion to abuse your fellow man?
Well, we started out that way. But, I mean, the founders already realized that at some point we're going to get around to this point again. It's just over time, it's kind of like that fourth generation of wealth building that they talk about. The first generation builds it, the second one expands it, the third one maintains it, and the fourth one blows it. When you get far enough away, from the blood, sweat, and tears that created it, you know, your new society in the first place, and where it was a privilege and all that to serve, you start, you know, things get diluted, and then you start attracting some of the worst people.
It's like the rust. Eventually, everything wants to turn into rust.
I see many examples of folks who struggled exactly with Shannon's observations. And it appears to me that the most common response has been that of President J.Q. Adams, who said that you must lay a foundation of morality and education in order to maintain it. And if you look at, for instance, Jewish culture, okay? Many cultures have a rite of passage, okay? It's usually some act of physical courage or strength. You know, amongst Jewish families, becoming an adult is showing the mastery of literacy, you know, being able to read the law. So there's an understanding that you have to be literate, you have to be educated, you have to have some sense of moral foundation in order to take your place in society. And it's a constant struggle because, you know, the temptations for power are such. I mean, the world is such. I mean, goodness, you know, I see any kind of abuse of power as a form of idolatry, bowing down to a graven image, and ultimately that graven image is yourself. I'm kind of waxing and going in different directions, but I'm just saying that, you know, we have, you know, people have taught how to keep things going as, you know, long as possible. I mean, Plato talked about it, and even, you know, for what it's worth, Aristotle talked about a different, you know, progression, you know, monarchies to a polity, breaking down into a democracy, and then into an aristocracy and monarchy again. And I mean, these were Plato and Aristotle were writers that the founders of the American Republic read well and reflected upon quite a bit. And I'll add that even President John Adams reflected on some of the lessons from the first 5 books of the Old Testament, and found much merit in Torah for you know, raising a moral society. I'm digressing, Matt.
Yeah, but he also pointed out that
conversation.
The Constitution would only work in a Christian and educated, well-informed and moral society. It was wholly insufficient for any other.
I'm not sure if
you get the wrong people in power, and things start to rot, and you get people in power for all the wrong reasons, then they make policy. It becomes a cycle that gets us to where we are today.
I think Ben Franklin wanted people to have a great familiarity with Confucius. So I think that, you know, a firm grasp and application of that which Confucius taught over 2,500 years ago would work just as well, you know, within North America as teachings of St. Paul, the Gospels, you know, Torah, and that. I just offering that for a.
Well, oh yeah, Pascal has a thought here.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, it was just this is a very interesting discussion, and obviously, yeah, we can't avoid the idea of morality and how our leadership, whichever system we have of government, the leadership has to evolve in that way. The population has to provide leaders that have that quality of morality and whichever religion they come from. But also I was thinking, it's much more common in the United States when you see veterans, usually people say, thank you for your service. But what does service mean, So these people who go to fight. And I would say that public servants, people that work for the government, should have the same ethos and, should be serving people as they are working there. So basically anything that's personal, anything that has to do with yourself has to be, put on the side while you're there, and you're not working for your own interests. You're really working for the people. It's really, and you have, as Shannon has said, also from the foundation of the American Republic, the founders were not crazy. They understood that there would be temptations, and so the system of checks and balances is also something very important. Even though obviously, if you have corrupt people, they tend to corrupt the system. So you need the uncorrupted people to hold on and keep it the way it was, created, the good way, or improve it, So that was just my 2 cents.
Yeah, I got the quote from John Quincy Adams. Or John Adams, actually. It wasn't Quincy, it was John. John Adams. Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other. And yeah, and I think that's the thing. Like, I was thinking about a little bit of this question on top of what Pascal was saying, and Peter. I mean, there's so much so many fruitful thoughts. But I was thinking about the question of power and how power is both outward and inward at the same time. It's not just outward. I have power to control, right? There's also, do you have power? Like we use simple terms like, the power of sight. It's a capacity. I have the power. Do you have the power to build something? Do you have the knowledge, which requires, if you're going to build a house, you have the power to build a house. Well, that means you have to have the knowledge of how to build a house. If you don't have that knowledge, you might think you have the power, but you start putting into action a process, it'll like kill somebody. So there's this precondition for power of, do you have power over yourself? Have we taken the time to come to examine ourselves and work on our own, our own baggage, our trauma, our vices, and work through our love of virtue, really to develop a sense of the health of the soul? Have we come to even discover that we have a soul, let alone how to make it better, or what do we have to do to make it worse that we wouldn't want to do, right? Like a lot of people, they haven't developed a power over their inner, over themselves, and then they try to skip steps and go out into the world and do things without having even met the basic conditions for even low level wisdom. So they're people who are completely fools. Like, listen to Justin Trudeau, poor schmuck of an idiot, trying to go out there and think that he actually thinks he has authority to run things. There's nothing there. He's a tool to be used by handlers. He has no free will in that sense. He's an instrument for the will of others, as are unfortunately many people who never had a knowledge of themselves. So I think that's sort of the thing in my mind. I'm like, well, do we have to have an education system or cultural institutions that make us worse people and deprive us of power over ourselves before we then are put out as cogs in a machine? Or can we possibly feasibly have cultural and educational and artistic institutions that make us better people as they're designed to do? I don't think that education was designed to make us dumber as it is doing. It was created, that's why we have it, is to make us smarter.
Education, no. School, yes.
Well, that's the thing, right?
School is relatively new.
Yeah,
Yes.
but the idea of going to school doesn't necessarily have, it could be a place where good things happen too. It doesn't have to be a place where bad things happen,
Well,
that schooling serves the oligarchical plutocratic structures.
If you let them take over, sure. I mean, yeah.
Most teachers have never been outside of a classroom. That's a big part of the problem.
If you let teachers who don't have real knowledge come in and teach, yeah, sure.
Well, that's
but that's the thing, right?
Teachers that teach the teaching profession in with the school system. That's the problem right there. You don't have people with any life experience.
No, I know.
Teaching, and most of them aren't going to stay.
You're commenting on as a doctor on a diseased patient, saying why they're diseased and why they're dying. I agree what you're doing, but I'm just saying, does it have to?
But how do we go about changing that, Matt?
That's why we're having these. That's why we're reading LaRouche right now.
I it's interesting. I want to share, you know, that the U.S. Department of Education has existed only since the Carter administration.
Yeah.
And one of the interesting early supporters of it was Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson, the Lubavitcher Rebbe, or quote, the Rebbe from Crown Heights in Brooklyn. He had a very clear condition upon his support. He wanted it to be an institution that awakened moral education within students. That was actually the first job, and not some kind of institutionalizing of curricula or agenda, but for moral education. And I think that if you looked into the history of some public school systems in the nation, particularly New York public school at the beginning of the late 19th and early 20th century, they were not averse to moral education, at least being good citizens and doing what good citizens of a republic did, without having to put a Protestant or a Catholic or a Jewish or a Confucian label upon it. And they were good at that, or at least they were successful. Successful so much that they actually had meritocratic high schools within the city at one time for different enterprises, and areas of study. But
Yeah.
that's my contribution. I'm trying to share without digressing further.
I'd
No,
like to
but
say
I
something.
I think, Peter, that you stress one thing that is very important, and that is not easily accepted. Okay, not everyone is at the same epistemological level, and we have to accept that. And it's the kind of basic justification for oligarchy, if you want, an open oligarchy.
Mm-hmm.
I think he froze. I think he's probably still speaking.
Yeah. I don't know, but everyone is frozen for me, but I must be frozen for everyone, I suppose.
Yeah. Declan and Susie. Susan, I saw your hand up there for a while now. Yeah.
Matt, in what you were saying previously, you brought in the word authority, and that's a concept that moving forward, we need to keep in mind and understand better, because everything that you're saying about growing in yourself and gaining self-control and self-discipline and control over the lower parts of our nature or whatever, that enables you to stand in your own authority, and then you don't have to resort to control. And most people that are in power try to gain power so that they can control others, because they don't know how to stand in their own authority.
Okay.
And so growing as a person enables you to recognize that in other people. And as we take back our governments and build new systems and new institutions, we have to have our senses tuned to recognize that in others, and to not allow people that don't have true authority to take hold of the reins of power.
Well said.
Yeah, absolutely. And you need to have a very strict system of meritocratic selection, precisely.
Well, I mean, people, I mean, like, I think here's the thing, like they say the people get the governments that they deserve, in a sense. It's harsh. Yes. It's a harsh statement, but it's kind of true in the sense that, if people generally can see with more than just their five senses, like we have sort of an instinct for resonating to wisdom. And, we all have had experiences with good teachers. A couple of them I've had experiences with in my life. And it's like, they didn't have to, they were very humble people. And it was like just their presence exuded humility, but also real knowledge. They weren't trying to prove anything. You could see that they just had a confidence and a playfulness that they didn't have to like give me answers or anything. They were just, there was that flexibility, right? And I think generally speaking, when people become too materialistic and they lose sense of those spiritual qualities in themselves, they can't really see it so easily outside of themselves, because we only have ourself through which to observe the external world, right? And so we're we're self-referential in that sense. And
We look-
I think the thing with
And
our
either-
society is there's a lot of superficiality that is made possible because of the superficiality of the culture and of the individuals who tend to then fall for an Obama or a Justin Trudeau or a Ursula von der Leyen and don't see how absurd these people actually are. But like you said, Susan, I think that, yeah, if you actually have wisdom individually, you could sense wisdom outside very quickly. You could see, okay, this person's figured out some stuff I want to learn from, and I'm going to pay attention, and, you know, their authority will come more organically in that sense. Like Washington didn't want to be the president, right? And it was his not wanting to be the president that made it so important that he was the president at that time of crisis. Or
And
Cincinnati.
also, I think it's important to understand that a lot of the superficiality and the materialism that we're seeing around us today is a result of the continual trauma that our entire world has been through. It's like so many people are just stuck in fight or flight and just reaching for the nearest thing to provide some comfort. And most people would have very little idea of how to even engage in these conversations. So I think there's a lot of people out there that we're going to have to bring them along very gently.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Whether it's ethics, it's power, or it's material. I mean, whenever you take away a certain structure, you know, vacuums are always very dangerous because what's going to fill it is going to be often the most dangerous thing.
You know, President Lincoln did observe once,
Oh, yeah.
if one wants to test somebody, place power into their hands. That's a huge test.
Yeah. Declan, I noticed you had a thought earlier on.
Yeah, I was thinking about the whole thing about the school system and how to solve that. Because one thing, when my dad was growing up, his mom was very involved in his local school that he went to, and it was the same for like everybody's moms. It was very important that the parents were involved in the school. But now that's kind of departed. There's not as much involvement. It's been very much institutionalized, and so part of the way to take back the schools is to get involved in them, and we're seeing that right now with the school board meetings. It's like in around the country where these parents are saying, well, no, you're not teaching that stuff to my kid. And it's starting to pull them out and doing alternatives like homeschooling.
Yeah.
And stuff like that. And so there's ways to solve it. And there's many ways to solve it. And I think there's a lot of hope of what's going on right now, even though it looks really bad. Because it's all coming out. That's part of it. It's just things are coming out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Only way to get rid of is it. Gotta have some pus coming out.
Yeah. Ripping off the Band-Aid right
now. No, Declan is a good living example of the effectiveness of homeschooling. I think there is a homeschooling renaissance going on right now, and it is something I'm seeing from a lot of quarters. That's one good thing that the last couple of years has given to us is a homeschooling renaissance.
Yeah.
And I think the more that you have people who are just so much more effective as people coming out of that process, to have as a contrast to the sick souls that have been put through the institutionalized brainwashing system, it's kind of like, I don't want to draw this contrast too much because this is recorded for the Rising Tide Foundation. So actually, I was going to make a whole COVID thing, but anyway, no, I'll stop. But yeah, no, I stand by exactly what you said, Declan. And Martin, you were going to say something?
I homeschooled my son for a few years. It was very interesting. And one of the books that I would recommend for learning the history of education is John Taylor Gatto's book.
Right.
Actually, he had several books, but I think one was like Underground History of American Education or something like that. And he was a New York City teacher. He had first-hand experience teaching, and he wrote quite a good book. It's an eye-opener.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Peter?
How do we spell John Taylor Gatto's last name? I do want to look up that.
Gatto is, I think, Gatto.
Copy that.
Yeah, it's worth reading. Okay.
Also, Quan will be delivering a lecture in a couple of or 3 weeks, I believe, on a topic which will be touching on this in a variety of nonlinear ways, and maybe some linear ways too. Quan, what's your class going to be about?
Do I give the title now?
Sure. Yeah, it's appropriate.
Hello.
Yeah.
Yep.
still there.
Oh,
We can hear you.
Okay. So the title is The Four Seeds, a Timeless Curriculum and Universal History.
All right, that's the teaser.
And
Sundays.
and it's about everything we discussed in the last 30 minutes.
Does that have a connection to the parable of the sower, Quan, when you talk about the 4 seeds?
Yeah, kind of. Well, I would say it's more a foundational thesis of Confucianism, but it has a certain link to the parable. Yes. Anyway, it's about the epistemological development.
Okay. I'm in.
All right. Eamon, it's good to see you, Eamon.
Hey, how you doing, Matt? It's good. Thank
Better late
you
than
for
never,
holding it at a decent time.
Eamon's on the other side of the world in Thailand.
Yeah, early here. Interesting subject.
Yeah, it's good. Well, guys, this was a really, as always, wonderful Wednesday night reading, and I guess for Eamon, Thursday morning conversation. And I'm looking forward to this. This Sunday, Adam Sedia, just so y'all know, is going to go through part 2 on his presentation on Plato's laws and law more generally, and I guess specifically too, probably. I'm not too sure what. Anyway, it'll be Sunday at 2 p.m. Montreal time, and then we'll continue on the reading of the LaRouche paper next Wednesday, same time as always. All right.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, everybody.
Sure.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Was
Have a
excellent.
good night.
Good night.
Cheers, Matt.
Have a good night, all. Thank you.
Cheerio.